Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. This is the 21st episode of the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Series, and I'm Chris Schott, a partner in the healthcare and life sciences practice in our Washington, D.C. office. I focus my practice on all things market access, and that includes manufacturer compliance related to the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, Medicare Parts B and D, and the 340B Drug Pricing Program. I also advise on current policy initiatives such as Most Favored Nation drug pricing policy issues, the ongoing implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as state law developments. Today, I'm very happy to welcome a DC office colleague as a guest on our podcast, Monica Groat, counsel in our FDA regulatory group. Monica, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Chris. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Monica Groat. I am counsel in Latham's FDA regulatory group. My practice really focuses on regulatory counseling for the entire product life cycle of drugs, devices, and other FDA-regulated products, with a particular focus on post-approval compliance and enforcement activities. Before I came to Latham, I was a trial attorney in DOJ's Consumer Protection Branch, where I focused on affirmative and defensive litigation on behalf of the FDA.
Thanks, Monica, and thank you for joining the podcast today. In each episode, we focus on a specific topic that is relevant to market access, drug pricing, or the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors more broadly. And after discussing the substance, we ask the question, which Olympic sport is it like? And we have the list of Olympic sports here to see which most resembles the topic in terms of strategy, complexity, or frankly, level of conflict. Our topic today is the FDA Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, also abbreviated as CNPV pilot program. This was first announced in mid-June when the FDA described it as, quote, a novel priority program by the FDA that shortens its review time from approximately 10 to 12 months to 1 to 2 months following a sponsor's final drug application submission. And as FDA said in its initial press release, the vouchers were intended for companies that are aligned with national health priorities. And FDA named 4 priorities when it initially discussed this program. And those 4 priorities were addressing a health crisis in the U.S., delivering more innovative cures for the American people, addressing unmet public health needs, and increasing domestic drug manufacturing as a national security issue. So here in the last point, we have the notion of onshoring manufacturing. So far, so good, but still we're squarely in FDA territory, nothing yet about drug pricing. But then in mid-July, FDA Commissioner McCary said in public remarks that, quote, we are including the affordability of drugs as a national priority. So the 4 criteria that had initially been announced were then expanded to include a 5th criterion, and Commissioner McCary added that, quote, we can issue a national priority review voucher for companies that are promising to equalize the price between OECD, that's Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, countries, and the United States, even with other products that they currently have. So here, the commissioner was clearly referring back to the Most Favored Nation pricing policy that Trump had previously announced in his second executive order that concerned drug pricing. And the commissioner concluded that, quote, we want to incentivize good behavior in the marketplace, and these priority vouchers are worth a lot of money. So this is a bit of an unusual development because here we see FDA wading into the drug pricing world. And it's also another example of the Trump administration's what I call cajole and coerce strategy when it comes to drug pricing, and particularly the MFN pricing policy. There is no legal basis to impose MFN pricing in the United States, and yet the administration is using the threat of tariffs and here the carrot of priority review to cajole manufacturers into pricing agreements, of which we have seen 3 that have been announced as of the date of this recording. So that takes us to October 16, when the FDA actually announced that it was granting priority review vouchers to 9 sponsors. So Monica, I've talked for a long time and laid out the background here at a very high non-FDA person's level, but maybe you can fill in anything I've left out here and also explain why these vouchers got so much attention.
Sure, Chris. That was a great overview of the program. I think the highlight from an FDA regulatory angle was the announcement that the voucher program would be a shift from the typical 10 to 12-month review cycle for drug and biologics applications submitted to FDA to a 1 or 2 month cycle. That is a significantly shorter review cycle, even if you take into account some of the already existing accelerated approval and review voucher programs that were already in existence. FDA said it's speeding up this cycle in a couple of different ways. It is requiring the submission of manufacturing information, which you'll see referred to as CMC or chemistry manufacturing and controls information, in advance of the application being completely submitted. I think with the idea that some of that information is not going to change depending on the outcome of trials. The review process for this program also was described as including a tumor board style review. And in comments made by the commissioner, it seems that it will involve sharing the application throughout the agency and then having a one-day meeting with sort of the lead expert reviewers for the different parts of the application together and really hash out whether or not they think the application should be approved. We now know that nominations for this program were sought both from manufacturers of the products and from within FDA. That's different than other priority review programs that are solely an application-based initiative. In addition to the consideration of price that Chris mentioned, the location of manufacturing and the kind of emphasis of onshoring was previously not a factor that FDA considered. And finally, unlike other vouchers, these priority national review vouchers cannot be sold. As the audience may know, these vouchers, the other priority review vouchers, are often sold for, $100 million. So these priority national review vouchers cannot be transferred in the same way, but they can be held by the company, and it appears that they can be acquired by a company acquiring the company holding the voucher. So there are ways for the vouchers to kind of move among different corporate entities.
Wow. So again, as a non-FDA person, this notion of people getting together in a room makes me wonder whether those companies that did not get this review voucher are going to actually have their reviews slowed down, because if everyone's hashing out the priority applications in the conference room, I'm wondering how much time they might have for the ongoing day-to-day business of looking at other applications.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Even if you set aside the current government shutdown, which is certainly limiting FDA's activities, FDA has goals called PDUFA goals for the dates by which it will review all of its applications. Those goals are not binding. They are goals, but it does seem that FDA is putting a significant number of its limited resource into this priority review program, and it remains to be seen kind of how it will affect the review of other applications across the board.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're definitely seeing quite a departure here from a normal process. And we already mentioned that drug pricing, or as they called it, affordability, is now one of the criteria for getting one of these vouchers. And that also seems to mark a different approach from FDA's history so far. So you already mentioned some points, but how otherwise do these vouchers differ from the FDA's traditional priority review or other prior voucher programs?
Sure, Chris. Yes, as I mentioned, there are other voucher programs currently in existence. They're for rare tropical diseases and medical countermeasures, so two very specific categories of products. Until recently, there was also a rare pediatric disease voucher that lapsed, and FDA and others are currently lobbying for the renewal of that program on the Hill. But as of today, those vouchers are not being issued. As I mentioned, there are different ways that the vouchers under these two different sets of programs can be transferred. And another interesting difference is that for the rare tropical disease and medical countermeasure vouchers, those vouchers are issued after the product is approved, and then the voucher can be applied to another product that the company has, or the voucher can be sold. In the case of these priority national review vouchers, the vouchers can either be designated, so it's issued for a specific product and the company has to use the voucher towards that product, or can be undesignated, in which case the company can choose which product to apply the voucher. FDA also has other non-voucher-based mechanisms to speed up review: breakthrough therapy, fast track, accelerated approval, a number of different programs. It was interesting that when we saw the announcement of the 9 products last week, some of those products were already taking advantage of some of these other programs, which is typical. There's often overlap at FDA within all the different designations and voucher programs that can be granted. At a very high level, without going in the weeds on the different programs, the benefits are typically faster review, but it's typically as fast as a 6-month timeline, not the 1 or 2-month timeline contemplated for the priority national review vouchers. And then another benefit that applies across the board is more frequent communication and faster responses from FDA when a manufacturer has questions about its application or is trying to clarify questions from FDA.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot going on, and this is a good a time as any for me to drop in a quick reminder that we are also publishing the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Digest every second Monday. So if you search for Latham Drug Pricing Digest, you can find it online, or if you want to receive it in your inbox at the start of every other week, click on the subscription link in the podcast notes, or if you don't want to deal with the cumbersome web form, simply shoot me an email. And we just published Digest issue number 57, so it's been running for quite some time. So the latest development here, of course, is that these vouchers were now awarded to 9 sponsors, and we will put a link to the FDA press release that lists the sponsors on the products into the podcast notes. So in terms of these vouchers that have now been granted, do you see any themes among these recipients? Is there really a link to affordability and domestic manufacturing? Monica, what have you observed there?
Yeah, the products announced treat a wide variety of different diseases and conditions. It was interesting that 9 vouchers were announced when the program was announced back in June, FDA committed to awarding about 5 vouchers, which is a pretty significant expansion of the program. The products for which the vouchers were announced are in different stages of development. Some are very early stage, some have trials that are nearing completion, and FDA is aware of some early results for those trials. And some of these products have actually been approved for other indications, and the trials are really focusing on new uses for these products. The products overall appear to meet the 5 criteria that FDA articulated, but I think we're going to focus in on affordability and domestic manufacturing. So let's talk about a couple of the specific vouchers. So Pergoveris, which is an infertility drug, was announced as the recipient of a voucher. That drug was also announced as part of Trump's MFN initiative for pricing, and I believe was also excluded from the Section 232 tariffs if the company makes certain commitments with onshoring production. So that drug was often, I think, in the headlines of the announcements regarding this program because of the overlap between the voucher program and the MFN initiative. Another product that seems to have been granted a voucher because of affordability claims is DBOTO, which has a proposed indication for deafness. This is a product that has already been able to take a lot of advantages of other FDA accelerated approval programs. It's been designated as an orphan drug, a rare pediatric disease, as part of the Fast Track program, and has received a couple other designations. During the announcement of these 9 drugs, McCary said that, quote, "We're hearing the company may make it available either at an extremely low price or for free, which, of course, is part of a national priority to make drugs more affordable. So we would love that." So clearly, this drug was selected, at least in part, because of what FDA had heard about pricing. The company pushed back a little in a public statement, saying it was too early to discuss price. So we'll have to see what happens once that drug is reviewed and possibly approved. Turning to domestic manufacturing, there were 2 drugs selected specifically because of where the company wants to manufacture them. The first one is ketamine, specifically for its use as a general anesthetic. The manufacturer of the ketamine product that was selected said that they want to establish a fully domestic end-to-end supply chain from raw material to finished dosage form that would close a vital gap in national health security, a statement that's clearly aligned with some of the goals of the program. Interestingly, FDA's announcement doesn't really focus on any of the fairly well-known off-label uses of ketamine for treatment of mood disorders and chronic pain. So this voucher is being granted for ketamine for use as a general anesthetic. The other product that was announced as part of the domestic manufacturing priority is Augmentin XR, an antibiotic. It's a fixed-dose combination of penicillin, amoxicillin, and a lactamase inhibitor acid, which is used to overcome a mode of antimicrobial resistance. It's a broad-spectrum antibiotic. I thought it was notable that when McCary made the announcement of this particular drug on his podcast, he immediately then started discussing antibiotic overprescription, both in the US and then abroad. But he was very clear in acknowledging that antibiotics are an important tool to combat a variety of diseases. So if Augmentin is able to kind of meet the onshoring commitments that it made to get this voucher, it will be interesting to see whether there are changes in that particular market.
Well, Monica, thanks for tracking that in such detail. It's very insightful to hear how really these different vouchers were awarded based on these criteria. Whenever I hear stuff about things are going to be free or maybe just at a penny price, as is the case in 340B, reminds me of stories from my relatives from formerly communist East Germany, where the price for bread at the bakery was set at some point in the 1950s and never increased. So if you had pets or you were raising pigs or something, you would go to the bakery and buy the bread to feed to your animals because that was cheaper than otherwise buying feed. So, just a little thought here about free stuff and the government mandating super low prices. Okay, so we've highlighted that by tying the vouchers to affordability, FDA is entering somewhat into new territory with these particular vouchers. So do you think, Monica, that this is really a signal for an entirely new stance by FDA with respect to pricing? Is the agency likely to further go into this territory? What's your expectation there?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I certainly think it's a significant step for FDA, but it's not entirely unprecedented for FDA to consider price. I think the biggest example is the generic program, which is at least partially designed to kind of lower drug costs by having a different approval pathway for generic drugs. Certain members of Congress have also been pretty explicit in pressuring FDA specifically to approve lower cost alternatives to certain drugs. And there's recent litigation in the 11th Circuit that was focused on FDA's interpretation of its authority to approve a competitor drug for a drug that was originally approved to treat a rare disease. And that approval really was hinged on the fact that having two competitor drugs on the market could potentially lower the price. Um, in terms of whether this is sort of the beginning of a significant sea change for FDA, McCary certainly seems willing to address cost explicitly when talking about the approval process. And I think it will be interesting to see whether the next batch of drugs to which these priority national review vouchers are awarded similarly contain products for which the manufacturer has claimed they can lower the cost of the drug.
Yeah, so it really seems that this is another, more paint being added to this picture of this administration looking for all possible means to cajole, coerce, or in this case, using a carrot to impact drug pricing in the United States. So Commissioner McCary in his earlier remarks stated that these priority vouchers are worth a lot of money, but we've heard now that they can't actually be transferred. So can you explain a little bit what this financial benefit is of getting one of these vouchers? How could a 1 to 2 month review change launch strategies? What's really the value here?
Yeah, I think some of that remains to be seen, but the biggest potential value seems to be that the holder of a voucher who uses the voucher to get a 1 to 2 month review and subsequent approval could beat the competitors to the market and really significantly capture market share early. In certain therapeutic areas, that might lead to the establishment of premium prices where there's really no competition. However, since this voucher program is also considering cost, if a lower cost drug is the first to enter the market, it could actually kind of reduce the overall cost of other products in that market. I think the fertility drug that received a voucher, its MFN pricing, for example, could change the pricing in the fertility space generally. I think the DBOTO product that we discussed earlier is also an interesting example. It's a gene therapy, which typically have known for being quite expensive drug products. So offering that gene therapy, while very specific to treat a certain disease, could really change how gene therapies are priced across the board.
Yeah, that's interesting because, again, thinking about the European situation where, of course, prices are lower because they're government controlled, I'm personally aware of a number of especially really innovative therapies like gene therapies that are just not available in the European market. And that's, of course, because it was impossible, apparently, there to charge a price that would be in line with the cost of making and developing the drug. So it'll be interesting to see what the impact in the United States is of all these measures. And this is already pretty controversial. Maybe with that, we focus a little bit more on controversies surrounding these vouchers and maybe some potential risks. So critics have flagged transparency and fairness concerns, among others. Monica, what are some critiques of this selection process?
Yeah, initially the selection criteria when the program was first announced, the criteria themselves were very high level. As you mentioned, Chris, the pricing criteria was actually added later on, but even today, the criteria are still pretty vague, and I think industry is still learning what FDA expects to see in a submission that a product should be part of this program. The larger than expected cohort of 9 vouchers issued, as opposed to the up to 5 initially announced, also I think is raising some uncertainty as to the scope of the program, whether this is going to be a limited targeted program within FDA or is really going to change the way that FDA reviews drugs and biologics generally across the board. There's certainly, because of the lack of information, the potential for challenges under the Administrative Procedure Act. And finally, with the inclusion of the fertility drug in the announcement that was also part of the administration's MFN initiative, there is potential that the voucher program could be perceived as really being influenced by political priorities outside of the agency, and that those priorities, rather than even the high-level criteria that FDA has stated, are what is driving the selection of the voucher awardees.
Yeah, lack of transparency, that seems to be another theme of this administration, just like in the MFN space, where there have been confidential agreements that remain confidential. We've already chatted a little bit about the burden that these fast reviews might be putting on FDA resources. So, Monica, do you think it's even possible for FDA to maintain review rigor if it's on a 1 to 2 month timeline? And are there also possible patient safety or evidentiary risks that you might see here?
I certainly think it's possible, but it would involve a significant shift in relation to how FDA reviews applications, even applications that are typically reviewed within 6 months. I do think shifting some of the review of the manufacturing information, the CMC, the labeling information earlier in the process is smart. However, that raises the question as to how a pre-approval inspection of the facility at which the product is manufactured will fit into this timeline. In my experience, that's typically one of the last steps of the approval, except for the products that are explicitly being manufactured domestically. That's often a overseas inspection. It's also not clear what, if any, role advisory committees will play with respect to these products. The agency is certainly currently downplaying the importance of these committees, and this may be a further reason to not rely on them. And frankly, this entire concept of a tumor board style meeting that we discussed earlier, I think is very unclear. There are certainly a lot of moving parts at FDA that are reviewing these applications and expecting one representative from each to actually find a time where they can come together and discuss an entire application for a day seems like a challenge. And again, in addition to the shutdown, the reduced workforce and kind of ongoing attrition at FDA may make this just a tougher job than FDA anticipated initially. I do think there are possible patient safety risks, but I think it's hard to sort of predict what that could look like, since those are typically very specific to the particular products. And I do think, Chris, kind of in your area, there could also be kind of payer hesitancy with products that are, approved on a much shorter timeline. Does the government want to spend its money covering these products if they're concerned with the review process that led to their approval?
Yeah, and that's certainly a policy question that's come up previously as well, where even advisory bodies in the government have discussed whether coverage should be different based on different, modes of FDA approval.
I will add that a couple of the products that were selected could be described as non-innovative products, which already typically have shorter review periods. So if the voucher program is eventually used primarily to focus on the product, that may be actually a reason that the program could work and that it's tightening up an already a reduced review process length. But we'll have to see how that plays out.
Interesting. Well, overall, it just seems that FDA is somewhat aggressive here in its approach. And you've heard me say on multiple podcast episodes that for the past few years, even going back to the Biden administration, we've seen a lot more activism from the executive agencies generally. And oftentimes in this sort of new executive 2.0, and now with Trump maybe 3.0 level of aggressiveness, the only avenue for really pushing back has been litigation. Certainly in the drug pharmaceutical pricing space, we've seen a lot more of that than ever before in its history. So what about here with these vouchers? Monica, do you anticipate that there are going to be legal challenges?
I do, yes. I think unsuccessful applicants seem like the party that maybe have the most reason to sue in these cases. Again, under the APA arbitrary and capricious standard, given that the criteria of this program are still very unclear. The voucher program itself is grounded in sort of FDA's general authorities under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act for drugs and the Public Health Service Act for biologics, but it's notably not grounded in a specific statute, which is true of the other voucher programs and also kind of other means of speeding up review like breakthrough designation and accelerated approval. So I think that could be one way of challenging the authority of FDA to even set up a program like this. Any kind of adverse ruling in a district court could ground the program to a halt, therefore undoing the advantages of the 1 to 2 month approval. And in addition to parties who applied for but weren't granted a voucher, I think we could also see challenges by those applicants that have applications pending, but FDA it does not act on their applications and goes well beyond the typical PDUFA deadline. I shouldn't say deadline because PDUFA establishes goals, not deadline. But if an application sits for years and FDA is really focused on approving these voucher products, I think we could anticipate litigation there. Apart from litigation specifically, I do also think this will have an effect on kind of corporate planning and M&A that will be tied to the voucher value, and that given the kind of unknowns about how this program will function in practice, I just think it throws more uncertainty into the mix.
Yeah, so once again, a lot that we need to track and watch here. So maybe with that, we can turn to some more general takeaways here for the stakeholders, and again, maybe highlight some other things to focus on and things to watch out for. So for pharma manufacturers specifically, what should they consider now in this new environment?
Yeah, well, I think one upside is that there does not appear to be a major downside for a manufacturer to throw their hat in the ring if they think they have a product that might be a good fit. I think the application is 350 words is what FDA is looking for. So hopefully not too much of a burden to put together. And I think it's also notable that FDA itself appears to have played a meaningful role in nominating a number of these products. So not only is there an opportunity for a manufacturer to submit an application, there could be real benefits to submitting what FDA considers to be a really strong application. And then with the goal that there would be an internal nomination based on someone in the review division thinking the particular product is a great candidate for the program. So thinking not only about the actual application process, but kind of the broader application strategy with FDA, I think is a good idea. That said, there just remains a lot of uncertainty. The value of the voucher, what the program will look like in practice. And I think, unfortunately, it's a little bit of wait and see. I do think the announcement was a reminder of two of the administration's key priorities, and those being onshoring manufacturing and in some ways encouraging statements about drug pricing maybe earlier on in the development process than they would typically seem earlier. FDA, in awarding these vouchers, reacted positively to both, so that might change companies' strategy from a bigger picture.
Yeah, and let's focus on the pricing issue a little bit more towards the end. So, like you already said, one of the voucher recipients had announced an MFN deal with the Trump administration just in the days before then receiving the voucher. In terms of tracking how the vouchers might, in fact, actually impact prices, what are some near-term milestones that might indicate whether the voucher program is actually moving the needle on drug prices?
Yeah, I think watching the fertility space will be interesting. My understanding is that product has been approved in Europe and other places. So if that is quickly adopted in the United States and used broadly, a lower price fertility product really could change a pretty significant market. And maybe a little later on, but similarly for the gene therapy product that was announced as part of this program, that, as we discussed earlier, a lower free price gene therapy product really has the potential to shake up that market and could affect gene therapy products for a wide variety of diseases and conditions. There's also uncertainty in the announcement as to the products that were awarded vouchers that have to be used for a specific product and the products that were just kind of awarded undesignated vouchers. So I think one other thing that will be interesting to watch is any signals that a company is using one of those undesignated vouchers for a product that we're not even aware of. I don't think the companies will necessarily be under an obligation to announce the use of the voucher, but there could be either explicit statements or signals that a voucher is being used. So different sectors of the healthcare industry really could be affected by uses of vouchers that were very recently issued, but for products that we don't know today.
Yeah, we live in exciting times. And maybe to wrap us up on this topic, we can go back a little bit to the FDA regulatory perspective. So, with that specifically, where do you think this program might have the most impact?
Yeah, in addition to price and a newer focus from FDA on onshoring, I really see that the program could change the way FDA reviews applications more broadly. I think the early submission of the CMC and labeling information that's part of its program might trickle down throughout the agency and potentially allow for more efficient review cycles. That said, and as I mentioned earlier, how inspections, specifically pre-approval inspections, will fit into that mix remains to be seen. Additionally, this use of this tumor board style review, if FDA finds it effective across the board or for specific product categories, we could see that type of review being used in divisions for categories of products, and that could really transform what until now has been a fairly stable and consistent FDA review process. Finally, there will be more litigation over FDA's approval process. Typically, some parties had been hesitant to challenge FDA because they saw litigation at the approval process as litigating scientific questions that a court might not be willing to address. Now, because of this new program and then other changes in the administrative law space, I expect that we'll see certain manufacturers at least far more willing to challenge FDA regarding their administration of this program and their approval decisions more generally.
Yeah, so shout out to our AP litigators. That group is probably going to get busier, it sounds like. Well, Monica, thanks for sharing your thoughts on this new FDA priority review voucher program. I've certainly learned a lot more detail than I had sort of gleaned just from tracking the pricing issues. And with that, we can go to the question we had posted at the very beginning. Which Olympic sport is it like? Monica, what do you think? Which Olympic sport do you think this is like?
So I'm a big fan of track and field and kind of professional running generally. And to me, this whole thing is really a marathon. There are going to be a lot of surges. It's going to be a long, arduous process. And I think in the end, certain companies will really benefit from it. And there may also be certain companies and manufacturers that fall behind, but we're not really going to know how that shakes out until the program has really run its course a couple times in terms of how the vouchers have been used.
Yeah, interesting. I believe back in history, the first marathon runner died after you finished the race. And I always love the images nowadays when people make it to the finish line and they're collapsing and can barely move. Hopefully, it won't be quite that
Yeah,
bad.
hopefully more of a celebratory feel for those who make it to the end of this
That's
marathon.
right. We can actually survive. Well, I today picked archery as the sport, and that's because similar to what you were thinking, I believe that the archery target is 70 meters away, so it's a far away target. You have to aim very carefully to actually hit the target. And then there are points that are awarded. So not only is it very hard to hit your target in the first place, but then you get points based on how you did, with 2 points for winning a set or 1 point for tying a set. So this whole points notion also, to me, seemed analogous here to all this, because the FDA is sort of giving you points, and it's not a one-time thing and you do one thing right and then you win. You got to keep doing it right and keep winning and accumulating points, and then maybe you end up winning overall. So, yeah, archery is what I think.
I learned something about archery today, so benefit for me.
So I think that nicely wraps up this episode of the podcast. It's a beautiful day in Washington today. The trees are changing colors. Monica, where are we going for the after party?
We are going to Daru, my favorite Indian restaurant in DC, which is on H Street. They also have a sister restaurant that recently opened, also on H Street, called Tapori. So if we really want to keep the party going, we have 2 venues to go to.
Let's do it. That sounds great. I'm very excited. Maybe on the way there, we'll just walk past the White House just to see what's going on there.
What part of it still exists?
That's exactly right. Thanks, Monica, again for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be on the podcast.
And thank you to our listeners for checking out the Latham & Watkins drug pricing series, which is part of our Connected with Latham podcast. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you have questions or would like additional information, or if you would like to subscribe to the digest, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.